Hi guys, we are discussing the book History of Indian Philosophy. Let me know if the audio is coming. Let me just check it once. We are discussing History of Indian Philosophy by Dr. Surendranath Dasgupta. Hello. Yeah. Audio seems fine, right? So, we are discussing a chapter called Early Upanishads. In this volume 1 of the History of Indian Philosophy. And in the chapter called Earlier Upanishads, we just finished the sub-chapter called Doctrine of Transmigration. Jairam ji ki abhay. The sub-chapter called Doctrine of Transmigration, we had just finished this yesterday. Today we will start the sub-chapter called Emancipation, which means moksha, obviously. So, वो डॉक्ट्रिन ऑफ ट्रांसमाइग्रेशन का थोड़ा रिकैप कर लेते हैं बिकॉज वी लर्न सम फैसिनेटिंग थिंग्स इन द वर्ल्ड सोल सब चैप्टर एंड देन डॉक्ट्रिन ऑफ ट्रांसमाइग्रेशन. ट्रांसमाइग्रेशन मीन्स आत्मा का एक शरीर से एक शरीर में दूसरे शरीर में जाना आफ्टर डेथ. सो देयर आर डिफरेंट स्कूल्स ऑफ थॉट एज वी लर्न यस्टरडे. ज्योतिषम ज्योति, लाइट ऑफ लाइट्स, दैट some people will some people after death, depending on their karma, will go to the basic elements, go through the basic elements up to the sun. So there's the pitrayana and devayana. So those who performed charitable deeds, or such public works as the digging of wells, etc., they follow after death the way of the fathers, which is pitrayana, in which the soul after death enters first into smoke, then into night, the dark half of the month, etc., and at last reaches the moon. After a residence there, as long as the remnant of his good deeds remains, he descends again through ether. Ether means akasha, vayu, smoke, mist, cloud, rain, herbage, food and seed. Ye sab se he comes back, and through the assimilation of food by man, he enters the womb of the mother and is born again. Here we see that the soul had not only recompense in the world of the moon, but was reborn again in the world. After that, the second way is, the other way is the way of the gods, devayana, meant for those who cultivate faith and asceticism, tapas. These souls at death enter successively into flame, then day, then bright half of the month, then bright half of the year, then sun, moon, lightning, and then finally into Brahman, and they never return because they lived a life of faith and tapas. Dyson has said that the meaning of the whole is that the soul on the way of the gods reaches regions of ever increasing light, in which is concentrated all that is bright and radiant as stations on the way to Brahman, which is the light of lights. And then we gradually find that hi Rohan, we gradually find that karma loses kind of its significance. People start saying that karma is not the most significant thing that leads you to whatever you will have after your death. Karma is the most important thing, because karma leads to will leads to action leads to the whatever the good or bad you are doing. So desire is the main thing. Desire jiska hoga, usse if you end up doing good deeds, you will have a somewhat of a better next life. If you do bad things, you end up having a worse life in the next birth. But if you get rid of desire itself, then you don't even have to suffer rebirth. They have used the word suffering rebirth. So the concept is that birth and life itself is a suffering. So the only question remains is whether you suffer less or you suffer more because of the things you do in your past life. So, and if you quit desire at all, if you quit desire altogether, then you don't have to be even reborn. Then you reach Brahman directly. Rampal Ashok Thakur is saying, sorry, tomorrow board exam maths, so won't be able to join today. Oh, you are also very young then. Okay, best of luck for your exam tomorrow. You can watch it later on. Okay, so that other line of thought is a direct reference to the doctrine of transmigration, Transmigration meaning आत्मा का एक शरीर से दूसरे शरीर में जाना after death. The doctrine of transmigration, unmixed with the idea of reaping the pall of his deeds by passing through the other worlds and without reference to the doctrine of the way of the fathers and gods, the yanas. Now thus, Yajnavalkya says, when the soul becomes weak, by soul becoming weak here it is meant that when the body is becoming weak, uske wajah se soul is becoming weak, body becoming weak meaning like right around the time of death. So when the soul becomes weak and falls into a swoon as it were, these senses go towards it, towards the Brahman. The soul takes these light particles within itself and centers itself only in the heart. Okay, all the senses collect in the heart. This is Yajnavalkya saying it. Thus, when the person in the eye turns back, then the soul cannot know color. And why the soul cannot know color? They will now explain. The soul cannot do a number of things, and they cannot do a number of things because it's about to die. So the soul cannot know color. The senses become one with him. People about him say he does not see the senses because he does not see the senses become he does not see because the senses become one with him. He does not smell, he does not taste, he does not speak, he does not hear, he does not think, he does not touch. All these senses are becoming one with the Brahman. So this is their way of interpreting death. He does not know. The tip of his heart shines, and by that shining the soul goes out. When he goes out, either through the eye, the head, or by any other part of the body, the vital function, that is prana, follows, which means that is the moment when he died. The vital function, the prana, follows out, and all the senses follow the prana in coming out. Sab senses us pran ke saath hi nikal gaya. He is then with determinate consciousness and as such he comes out. Knowledge, the deeds, which is karma, as well as previous experience, pragya, all that accompanies him, the self, the soul. Just like a caterpillar going to the end of a blade of grass by undertaking a separate movement collects itself. In the same way, this self, after destroying the body, removing ignorance, by a separate movement collects itself. Now, why are they saying that destroying the body, removing the ignorance? Because they are saying that the very fact that you are alive, the very fact that you have a body, the very fact that your soul chose to have this body in this life is a sign of ignorance, because you fully haven't realized Brahman yet. When you realize and internalize the supreme consciousness, the Brahman, the Brahmanaspati, Prajapati, whatever you want to call it, even Shiva or Krishna, if you are a follower of ISKCON or a Vaishnav. So the supreme consciousness, the very fact that you are alive means that you still have desire, and desire is leading you to will some things. Will is leading you to do some deeds, which is leading you to have a rebirth, which means you still haven't given up desire. Desire वो ही गिव अप कर सकता है जिसको वो रियलाइजेशन हो गया है कि what is Brahman and how and what are its capabilities, etc. Well, basically fully grasping the concept of Brahman. So therefore, removing ignorance is equal to destroying the body. By a separate movement collects itself. Okay, Abhay Singh, Rama Rama Jai Raja Ram, Rama Rama Jai Sitarama. Just as a goldsmith taking a small bit of gold gives it a newer and fairer form, in the same way, the soul, after destroying this body and removing ignorance, fashions a new and fairer form as of the Pitris, the Gandharvas, the gods of Prajapati or Brahma or of any other being. Just as he acts and behaves and that is how he becomes. Good by good deeds, bad by bad deeds, virtuous by virtuous deeds, and vicious by vice deeds. The man is full of desires. As he desires, so he wills. As he wills, so he works. As the work is done, so it happens. There is a small verse being attached to that he wants to gain by karma that to which he was attached. Okay. Whatever he was attached to, he wants to gain that further by doing karma. Having reaped the phal of the karma that is gone to the end. Having reaped the full phal of the karma that he does here, he returns back to this world for doing karma. So it is the case with those who have desires. He who has no desires, who had no desires, who has freed himself from all desires, is satisfied in his desires and in himself. His senses do not go out. He, being Brahma, attains Brahmahood. Thus the verse says, when all the desires that are in his heart are got rid of, the mortal becomes immortal and attains Brahma here. This is in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Okay. Let's fast forward a bit because we have done this yesterday. We are just doing a recap. Then the whole logic of genesis of karma and its phal is held up within him because he is a unity. He is a unity of the moral and psychological tendencies on the one hand and elements of the physical world on the other hand. I have underlined some stuff. It suffers no rebirth. They have specified this, that rebirth is itself a suffering. And only way to not have this rebirth is by quitting all desires. That it refers to desires as the cause of rebirth and not karma. This is one of the views in Upanishads. Okay, this destruction of desires is affected by the right knowledge of the self. क्योंकि बृहदारण्यक उपनिषद में कहा गया है कि he who knows his self as I am the person, for what wish and for what desire will he trouble the body? Because he knows himself. Ye not knowing yourself is the ignorance they were talking about. Even being here, if we know it, well, if we do not, what a great destruction. This is a quote from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. In former times, the wise men did not desire sons, thinking, what shall we do with sons, since this is our self and this is the universe. This our self is the universe. Also from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. None of the complexities of the karma doctrine, which we find later on in more recent developments of Hindu thought, can be found in the Upanishads. The whole scheme is worked out on the principle of desire, kama, and karma only serves as a link between desire and the actual effects desired and willed by the person, effects of the will and actions. So, 3 births. Let's see how 3 births happen according to Hindu thought. It is interesting to note in this connection that consistently with the idea that desires or kama led to rebirth, we find that in some Upanishads, the discharge of the semen in the womb of a woman is a result of desires and is considered as the first birth of man, and the birth of the son is the second birth of the man, and the birth elsewhere after death is regarded as the third birth of the man. Thus it is said, this is from Aitareya Upanishad, it is in man that there comes first the embryo, which is but the semen, which is produced as the essence of all parts of his body, and which holds within itself. It holds itself within itself in the semen, and when it is put in a woman, that is his first birth. That embryo then becomes part of the woman's self like any part of her body. It therefore does not hurt her. She protects and develops the embryo within herself. As she protects the embryo, so she also should be protected in the same way. Just as she protects her embryo, people should protect her. It is the woman who bears the embryo before birth, but when after birth, the father takes care of sons alone, that the continuity of the existence of people can be maintained. Obviously, that is his second birth, the man's second birth. He makes this self of his a representative for performing all virtuous deeds. The other self of his, after realizing himself and attaining age, goes away. And when going away, he is born again, that is his third birth. Third birth meaning, after death, his spirit has gone to someone else. That is transmigration, the subchapter we are discussing. This was a quote from Aitareya Upanishad. No special emphasis is given in the Upanishads to the sex desire or the desire for a son, being called kama. Because this is a very interesting part in Aitareya Upanishad, that they are not saying that only sex desire is kama, what we commonly know. That is just one of the views. The view here is that any desire is kama. So, the author is writing that no special emphasis is given in the Upanishads to the sex desire or the desire for a son, for being called kama. Whatever was the desire for a son was the same as the desire for money, and the desire for money was the same as any other worldly desire. This is being said in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad as well, and hence sex desires stand on the same plane as any other desire. Now we start a sub-chapter today called emancipation, which means moksha. Let me have a sip of coffee now. Jiten DTK is saying, good to see youth of your age making videos on such topics. Thank you. Now, emancipation. The doctrine which next attracts our attention in this connection is that of emancipation or mukti. Okay, so not moksha, mukti. Already we know that the doctrine of Devayana held that those who were faithful and performed asceticism or tapas went by the way of gods, which was called Devayana, way of the gods, through successive stages, never to return to the world and suffer rebirth. Suffer rebirth is a concept I'm fascinated with since yesterday, because they are admitting that life itself is suffering. So, how to not have rebirth? By giving up all desires. This could be contrasted with the way of the fathers, which is Pitrayana, where the dead were for a time recompensed in another world and then had to suffer rebirth. Thus we find that those who are faithful and perform Shraddha had a distinctly different type of goal from those who performed ordinary virtues, such as those of a general altruistic nature, dan dhyan karna. This distinction attains its fullest development in the doctrine of emancipation. Emancipation or mukti means in the Upanishads the state of infiniteness that a man attains when he knows his own self and thus becomes Brahman. Becoming Brahman, becoming one with Brahman. The ceaseless course of transmigration, the transmigration जो हो रहा है आत्मा का, उसका जो एकदम problem free journey है, the ceaseless course of transmigration is only for those who are ignorant. Okay, even if it's ceaseless, it's still for the ignorant. As long as you are being born, it means you are still ignorant, because you still haven't realized Brahman. The wise man, however, who has divested himself of all passions and knows himself to be Brahman, at once becomes Brahman, and no bondage of any kind can ever affect him, because he has gotten rid of all his karma or desires. So desire के बिना will नहीं है, will के बिना कर्म नहीं है, action नहीं है, and therefore rebirth नहीं है. Now they've given a quote: "He who holds that loftiest and deepest, for him the fetters of the heart break asunder. For him all doubts are solved, and his works become nothingness." The knowledge of the self reveals the fact that all our passions and antipathies, all our limitations of experience, all that is ignoble meaning not noble, all that is ignoble and small in us, all that is transient and finite in us is false. We do not know, but are pure knowledge ourselves. We are not limited by anything, because we are the infinite. We do not suffer death, because we are immortal. Mukti, thus, is not a new acquisition or product and effect or result of any action. Okay? Because if mukti was a result of an action, then again you would have rebirth. So, in this case, mukti is not a new acquisition or product or an effect or a result of any action, but it always exists as the truth of our nature. We are always emancipated and always free. We do not seem to be so and seem to suffer rebirth and thousands of other troubles only because we do not know the true nature of ourselves. This is great philosophy. मुक्ति वैसे भी था, और मुक्ति का पोटेंशियल वैसे भी था. मुक्ति is not because of any actions, unless you consider giving up of a desire also as an action, or giving up of the desire also a desire, then we will thinking that is going to take some deeper thought. We are always emancipated and always free. We do not seem to be so and seem to suffer rebirth and thousands of other troubles only because we do not know the true nature of ourself. Thus it is that the true knowledge of self does not lead to emancipation, but true knowledge is emancipation itself. That is the distinction. Okay? True knowledge of the self does not lead to emancipation. True knowledge is itself mukti. All sufferings and limitations are true only so long as we do not know ourselves. Mukti is the natural and only goal of man, simply because it represents the true nature and essence of man. It is the realization of our own nature that is called Mukti. Realization of our own nature. Since we are all already and always in our own true nature and as such emancipated, the only thing necessary for us is to know that we are so. Know that what is our true nature. Since we are already and always in our own true nature and as such emancipated, that means we already have Mukti. The only thing necessary for us is to know that we do have Mukti, is to realize that. Self-knowledge is therefore the only desideratum which can wipe off all false knowledge. All illusions of death and rebirth can be wiped out by self-knowledge. The story is told in the Katha Upanishad that Yama, the lord of death, promised Nachiketas, the son of Gautama, to grant him 3 boons at his choice. Nachiketas, knowing that his father Gautama was offended with him, said, "O death, let Gautama be pleased in mind and forget his anger against me." This being granted, Nachiketas asked the second boon, that the fire by which heaven is gained should be made known to him. This also being granted, Nachiketas said, "There is this inquiry, some say, the soul exists after the death of man, others say it does not exist. This I should like to know, instructed by thee. So explain to me, does the soul exist after death or not?" "This is my third boon," Yama said. "It was inquired of old, even by the gods, for it is not easy to understand it. Subtle is its nature. Choose another boon. Do not compel me to do this." Okay. Yama did not tell him then. Yama said, "It was inquired of old, even by the gods, because it is not easy to understand it. Its nature is subtle. Choose another boon. Do not compel me to do this." Nachiketas said, "Even by the gods was it inquired before. And even thou, O death, you are saying that it is not easy to understand it. But there is no other speaker to be found like you. There is no other boon like this." Yama said, "Choose sons and grandsons who may live 1,000 years, or live 100 years. Choose herds of cattle, choose elephants, ye sab cheeze mango, and gold and horses. Choose the wide expanded earth and live your life as many years as you wish. Or if you know a boon like this, choose that together with wealth and far extending life. Be a king on the wide earth. I will make you the enjoyer of all desires. All those desires that are difficult to gain in the world of mortals, all you ask, and at your pleasure. All those fair nymphs with their chariots, meaning apsaras, etc., with their musical instruments, the likes of them are not to be gained by men. I will give them to you. But do not ask the question regarding death." Yama does not want to answer the question about death. सिर्फ ये छोड़ दो, ये प्रश्न से अलावा जो कुछ भी मांगो मैं बोल रहा हूँ, मगर ये समझाने को मत बोलो. Nachiketas replied, "All those enjoyments are of tomorrow and they only weaken the senses. All life is short with you the dance and song, because you are death. Man cannot be satisfied with wealth. We could obtain wealth as long as we did not reach you, meaning as long as we don't die. As long as we did not reach you, the god of death, we live only as long as you please. The boon which I choose, I have said that I want to know whether my soul lives after death or not." To this, Yama says, "What a great conversation." I'll mark this. Yama and Nachiketas on death. Yama said, "One thing is good, another is pleasant. Blessed is he who takes the good, but he who chooses the pleasant loses the object of man. But you are considering the objects of desire. But you have stopped considering the objects of desire. You have abandoned them. These two, the ignorance, whose object is what is pleasant, and knowledge, whose object is what is good, are known to be far asunder and lead to different goals. So ignorance and knowledge, ignorance का काम है कि whose object is pleasant. Ignorance का object is pleasant because ignorance leads you to have desires lead you to will leads you to karma leads you to rebirth, etc. So that's ignorance. And knowledge, whose object is what is good. Knowledge is what leads you to have Brahman, because you get rid of all desire. So these two, ignorance and knowledge, are known to be far asunder and lead to different goals. Because one will cause you to have rebirth, one will not give you rebirth, one will lead you to attain Brahmahood and not even have a rebirth ever. Believing that this world exists and not the other, the careless youth is subject to my sway. Okay, so the youth that believes that this world exists, the ihalok, not the parlok, they are subject, they are vulnerable to my actions, that is me being death. That knowledge which thou hast asked is not to be obtained by argument. What you are asking about, whether soul is there after death or not. I know worldly happiness is transient, for that firm one is, because that firm one is not to be obtained by what is not firm. Okay, I know worldly happiness is transient, because that firm one is not to be obtained by what is not firm. The wise, by concentrating on the soul, knowing him whom it is hard to behold, leaves both grief and joy. This means knowing of the Brahman, realizing the concept of Brahman, internalizing the concept. The wise, by concentrating on the soul, knowing him whom it is hard to behold, because it is hard to behold Brahman, leaves both grief and joy. O Nachiketas, I believe to be like a house whose door is open to Brahman. Brahman is deathless. Whoever knows him obtains whatever he wishes. The wise man is not born. He does not die. He is not produced from anyone or anywhere. The wise man. Unborn. Eternal. The soul is not slain, though the body is slain. Subtler than what is subtle. Greater than what is great. What a great line. Unborn, eternal, the soul is not slain, though the body is slain. Subtler than what is subtle, greater than what is great. Sitting it goes far. Lying it goes everywhere. Thinking the soul of the soul as unbodily among bodies, firm among fleeting things. सब कुछ fleeting है, उसमें भी ये चीज, ये soul keeps being firm. The soul is unbodily among bodies. The wise man casts off all grief. The soul cannot be gained by eloquence, by understanding, or by learning. The soul cannot be gained by that. It can be obtained by him alone whom it chooses, whom the soul chooses. To him, the soul reveals its own nature. So long as the self identifies itself with its desires, he wills and acts according to them and reaps the phal in the present and in future lives. And future lives meaning suffering rebirth. So we are diagnosing the problem here. The problem कहाँ पे है कि soul, as long as your self identity, yourself is identified with what you desire. That, let's say, I want a phone and that is me, or I am who I want to become in life, or a great successful person, etc. All that is desire. As long as this happens, then you will keep having desires, which means anything that your desire will always cause you to have will, and will cause you to act, which will cause you to have a better or worse life in future lives. But when he comes to know the highest truth about himself, that he is the highest essence and principle of the universe, the immortal and the infinite, he ceases to have desires, and receding, like renouncing and pulling back from all desires, realizes the ultimate truth of himself in his own infinitude, because he is infinite. If at all he can let go of desire. Man, as it were, the epitome of the universe, and he holds within himself the fine constituents of the gross body, the Annamaya Kosha, the vital functions, the pranamaya kosha of life, the will, manomaya, and the thoughts and the ideas, vijnanamaya. And so long as he keeps himself in these spheres, that is, gross body, vital functions, the will and desire, as long as he keeps himself in these spheres and passes through a series of experiences in the present life and in other lives to come, these experiences are willed by him and in that sense created by him. He suffers pleasures and pains, disease and death. But if he retires from these into his true unchangeable being, he is in a state where he is one with his experience and there is no change and no movement. There is no change and no movement. What this state is cannot be explained by the use of concepts. ये conceptual level पे समझना मुश्किल है. What this state is cannot be explained by the use of concepts. One could only indicate it by pointing out that it is not any of those concepts found in ordinary knowledge. It is not whatever one knows as this and this, neti neti. It is not this or this. In this infinite and true self, there is no difference, no diversity, no miyam, and no tum. It is like an ocean in which all our phenomenal existence will dissolve like salt in water. Just like when we had done this quote from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad previously as well, they are repeating this quote now. Just like a lump of salt when put in water will disappear in it, and it cannot be taken out separately, but in whatever proportion of water we taste, we find the salt. In the same way, Maitreyi does this great reality, infinite and limitless, consisting only of Maitreyi does this great reality, infinite and limitless, consisting only of pure intelligence, manifesting itself in all these phenomenal existences, vanish in them, and there is there no phenomenal knowledge. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 2.4.12. The true self manifests itself in all the processes. The true self manifests itself in all the processes of our phenomenal existence. But ultimately, the true self वैसे भी है. The true self is there anyway because it's getting manifested in all the processes of our this ihalok, the real life actions and phenomenal existence. But ultimately, when it retires back to itself, it can no longer be found in them, in the phenomenal existence. It is a state of absolute infinitude, of pure intelligence, pure being, and pure blessedness. And that is the end of the chapter called Early Upanishads. And now we will get into general observations on the systems of Indian philosophy. Let me have a sip of coffee now. In what sense is a history of Indian philosophy possible? The author is asking himself the question now. It is hardly possible to attempt a history of Indian philosophy in the manner in which the histories of European philosophy have been written. In Europe, from the earliest times, thinkers came one after another and offered their independent speculations on philosophy. The work of a modern historian consists in chronologically arranging these views and in commenting upon the influence of one school of thought upon another or upon the general change from time to time in the tides and currents of philosophy. Chronologically एक के बाद एक आया European philosophy में. Here in India, however, the principal systems of philosophy had their beginning in times of which we have but scanty record. इतना पहले शुरू हुआ. And it is hardly possible to say correctly at what time they began, or to compute the influence that led to the foundation of so many divergent systems at so early a period, because in all probability these were formulated just after the earliest Upanishads had been composed or arranged. The systematic treatises were written in short and pregnant half sentences or sutras, which did not elaborate the subject in detail, but served only to hold before the reader the lost threads of memory of elaborate disquisitions with which he was already thoroughly acquainted. So sutras were not elaborate explanations. They were just but they served only to hold before the reader the lost threads of memory. Memory of what? Memory of elaborate disquisitions with which he was already thoroughly acquainted. It seems therefore that these pithy half sentences, the sutras, were like lecture hints. Let's underline this. Lecture hints intended for those who had the direct elaborate oral instructions on the subject. Uske liye sutra tha, not for the general mass, because they won't understand anything. It is indeed difficult to guess from the sutras the extent of their significance, or how far the discussions which they gave rise to in later days were originally intended by them. वो भी जानना मुश्किल है from sutras. कि sutras का impact क्या था. The sutras of the Vedanta system, known as the Sariraka sutras or Brahma sutras of Badrayana, for example, were of so ambiguous a nature that they gave rise to more than half a dozen divergent interpretations, each one of which claimed to be the only faithful one. Such was the high esteem and respect in which these writers of the sutras were held by later writers that whenever they had any new speculations to offer, these were reconciled with the doctrines of one or other of the existing systems and put down as faithful interpretations of the system in the form of commentaries. Okay. So, everyone claimed to be the only faithful interpretation, and whenever even new interpretations came out, anyone who even thought of any new things, they had to attach it to some existing school of thought in Indian philosophy, and then they would claim that this is the best interpretation and this is the only interpretation. Such was the hold of these systems upon scholars that all the orthodox teachers, such was the hold of these systems upon scholars that all the orthodox teachers, since the foundation of the systems, since the foundation of the systems of philosophy belonged to one or other of these schools. Yeah, the author had hinted this earlier as well. Every new thinker, all these systems, every scholar, itna importance tha of these systems of thought upon scholars that all the orthodox teachers, ever since the foundation of these systems of philosophy, belonged to one or other of these schools of thought. Their pupils were thus naturally brought up in accordance with the views of their teachers. All the independence of their thinking was limited and enchained by the faith of the school to which they were attached. This is an important part. All the independence of their thinking was limited and enchained, it was attached by the faith of the school to which they were attached. Instead of producing a succession of freelance thinkers having their own systems to propound and establish, India brought forth schools of pupils who carried the traditionary views of particular systems from generation to generation, who explained and expounded them and defended them against the attacks of other rival schools, which means debated them, which they constantly attacked in order to establish the superiority of the system to which they adhered. To take one example, the Nyaya system of philosophy, consisting of a number of half sentences or sutras, is attributed to Gautama, also called Akshapada. The earliest commentary on these sutras, called the Vatsyayana Bhashya, was written by Vatsyayana. This work was sharply criticized by the Buddhist Dinnaga, and to answer these criticisms by criticisms of Vatsyayana Bhashya by Dinnaga, इसको आंसर करने के लिए Udyotakara wrote a commentary on this commentary called Bhashyavattika. एक footnote दिया गया है. Surendranath Dasgupta is writing that I have preferred to spell Dinnaga after Vachashpati's Tatparyatika and not Dignaga as it is generally spelled. So because he is writing Dinnaga instead of Dignaga, because that's how it's written in Vachashpati's Tatparyatika. Tatparya, yeah. We know what Tatparya is. Tatparya Tika. So importance and commentary. Tika means commentary. Tatparya means importance. Important commentary, I guess. Tatparya tika. So this work was sharply criticized by the Buddhist Dinnaga, and to answer these criticisms, Udyotakara wrote a commentary on this commentary called Bhasyavattika. As time went on, the original force of this work was lost, and it failed to maintain the old dignity of the school. At this, Vachaspati Mishra wrote a commentary called Vartika Tatparya Tika on this second commentary, where he tried to refute all objections against the Nyaya system made by other rival schools and particularly by the Buddhists. This commentary called Nyaya Tatparya Tika had another commentary called Nyaya Tatparya Tika Parishuddhi, written by the great Udayana. The commentary had another commentary called Nyaya Nibandha Prakasha, written by Vardhamana, the son of the illustrious Gangesha. This again had another commentary called Vardhamanedu upon it by Padmanabha Mishra. And this again had another name, Nyaya Tatparya Mandana by Shankara Misra. The names of Vatsyayana, Vachaspati and Udayana are indeed very great, but even they contented themselves by writing commentaries on commentaries. Or it's always commentaries on commentaries, and did not try to formulate any original system. Even Shankara, probably the greatest man of India after Buddha, Shankaracharya, I guess, spent his life in writing commentaries on the Brahma Sutras, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. As a system passed on, it had to meet unexpected opponents and troublesome criticisms for which it was not in the least prepared. Its adherents had therefore the followers of these schools of any particular system therefore had to use all their ingenuity and subtlety in support of their own positions and to discover the defects of the rival schools that attacked them. They had to do that, using all their ingenuity and subtlety. A system as it was originally formulated in the sutras had probably only few problems to solve. But as it fought its way in the teeth of opposition of other schools, it had to offer consistent opinions on other problems in which the original views were more or less involved, but to which no attention had been given before. The contributions of the successive commentators served to make each system more and more complete in all its parts. The contributions of the successive commentators served to make each system more and more complete in all its parts, and stronger to enable it to hold its own successfully. The contributions of the successive commentators served to make each system of thought, each system of philosophy, more and more complete in all its parts, and stronger to enable it to hold its own successfully against the opposition and attacks of the rival schools. A system in the sutras is weak and shapeless as a newborn babe. But if we take it along with its developments down to the developments down to the beginning of the 17th century, it appears as a fully developed man, strong and harmonious in all its limbs. So it took about 2,000-3,000 years to develop a system of thought fully. So in the 1700s, it takes full coherent and comprehensive and concrete form. It is therefore not possible to write any history of successive philosophies in India. It's all parallel. Commentary pe commentary hote ja raha hai on different systems of thought parallelly, and all of them kind of take shape in the 1700s. It is therefore not possible to write any history of successive philosophies of India, but it is necessary that each system should be studied and interpreted in all the growth it has acquired through the successive ages of history from its conflicts with the rival systems as one whole. A footnote is given that in the case of some systems, it is indeed possible to suggest one or two earlier phases of the system, but this principle cannot be carried all through for all systems, because the supplementary information and arguments given by the later commentators often appear as harmonious elaborations of the earlier writings and are seldom in conflict with them. So what we notice here is that it is therefore not possible to write any history of successive philosophies in India, but फिर भी वो chronologically एक के बाद एक ऐसा philosophy आया, ऐसे history नहीं लिखा जा सकता of Indian philosophy, but it is necessary that each system should be studied and interpreted in all the growth it has acquired. हर system का कैसा growth हुआ, कैसा evolution हुआ, वो पढ़ना चाहिए. It is necessary that each system should be studied and interpreted in all the growth it has acquired through the successive ages of history. And how has that evolution and growth happened? Because of its conflicts with other rival systems as one whole. That should be read as one whole. The successive conflicts and resolutions and the evolution that happened, वो सब मिला के एक system की तरह हम इसको देख सकते हैं. In the history of Indian philosophy, we have no place for systems which had their importance only so long as they lived and were then forgotten or remembered only as targets of criticism. We don't have any philosophies like that, and we don't have to bother about them. Each system grew and developed by the untiring energy of its followers through all the successive ages of history. And the history of this growth is a history of its conflicts. What a great concept. History of the growth of each school of thought, each philosophy, is the history of its conflicts. No study of any Indian system is therefore adequate, okay, unless it is taken throughout all the growth, unless it is taken and seen from the lens of all the growth it attained by the work of its champions, the commentators whose selfless toil for it had kept it living through the ages of history. No study of any Indian system is therefore adequate unless it is taken throughout all the growth it attained by the work of its champions, the commentators whose selfless toil for it had kept it living through the ages of history. So this is the author's explanation of what does he mean when he writes a book called History of Indian Philosophy. This is what he means. That we are not going to discuss एक के बाद एक कैसे एक philosophy आया. He is going to analyze the evolution of all schools of thought and how they evolved resulting from the conflicts with other schools of thoughts. Okay, this is where we end the live stream. I will come online maybe at 11 or 12 again today. Then we will start a sub chapter called Growth of the Philosophic Literature. Okay. Okay, see you guys at 12 probably. Thank you for joining now.